So welcome everyone. I am Edoardo Guaschino. I'm postdoctoral researcher at the University of Lausanne, for those who don't know me. And today we have the pleasure to welcome Staffan Kumlin. Staffan is professor of political science at the University of Oslo. For those who don't know him, he's the authors of very numerous scientific articles in various areas of political science and in high top level journals. He is also the authors of numerous chapters in edited books and the author of highly cited books. Today, Professor Kumlin will present one of his recent research, I guess, entitled Political Trust in Changing Welfare State, Bringing Performance Back In. So he will talk for around 20-30 minutes, and then at the end of his presentation, we have a Q&A session. So for asking questions at the end of this presentation, do not hesitate to either raise your hand or to use the chat function. I take the opportunity to thank Professor Kumlin for accepting our invitation, and I would say that the stage is yours if you want to share the screen and start your presentation. Thanks a lot.
Sure. Thanks for this, Edoardo, and David and Tobias and everyone that I've been in touch with. Thanks for inviting me to this extremely interesting looking project and seminar series. It looks like a fascinating list of topics that seem very cohesive and you know, not just interesting, but they seem to belong together. So congratulations on that. So you already mentioned the title of the talk here. I will just go on here and say that, you know, the sort of dependent variable for this talk is political trust. I don't have time for any sort of fine definitions now, and I don't think I have to tell you that what political trust is necessarily, but let's just say that we measure it through survey items, survey questions on how much trust you have in politicians, parliament, political parties in general, you know. So it's not what you think about specific parties to the left and to the right. It's not, and it's certainly not if you're a Democrat in principle. But it's rather something to do about, you know, your general faith, trust in the democratic system and its main actors as they operate in practice in general. And as you surely know, there's a lot of research on this. And if anyone who's interested in delving deeper into this could have a look at this handbook on political trust. That is an excellent introduction. 500 pages. I have a chapter in it, and quite a lot of what I'm going to say today is sort of discussed in that chapter, but I will also talk about a couple of recent, more specific papers that I will sort of pull into the story as we go along. What else? Well, so a lot of research, and I think we'll have more of it over time. I think since 2016, the year of Brexit and Trump, I think the world has discovered that political trust is not just something that is fun to discuss for political scientists, but it's actually something that has real world consequences. And in this book, one of the things that's noted is that we have much more research on the causes of political trust actually than the consequences. But I think this is now shifting a little bit. You know, we know that political trust has an effect on populist right voting. It seems to affect if people abide the law, perhaps, if they pay taxes, and it might also affect policy demand in various complex ways. So it has consequences, and it therefore becomes interesting to look at the causes of it. which is what this talk is about, actually. And here's just an illustration of what I'll talk about. And looking at one specific explanatory factor in particular, how is political trust affected by evaluations of performance of public services and social protection. So performance is a kind of a catchword there that I'll use a lot. Do we get less political trust if what we can call the welfare state does its job poorly? Do people generalize from that? Do they generalize from those specific evaluations to broader political trust orientations, attitudes towards politics and democracy? Is the question. Why would people make a generalization like that? You could say that, well, in a well-functioning democracy anyway, this is not supposed to happen. If people are dissatisfied with stuff that is important to them, they are actually supposed to, according to democratic theory, they're supposed to hold specific political parties, specific actors, specific governments to account if they're dissatisfied with something that is important. They're not supposed to lash out in general against politics and democracy in general. That's the sort of democratic theory, you could say, but unfortunately, certainly in European welfare states, I don't think that this theory works very well in practice. This is the idea of electoral accountability, which doesn't work a lot of the time, I would say. We know that, for example, dissatisfaction with public services and social protection don't really necessarily always affect, let's say, voting for the incumbent government or supporting other political actors inside the political system that might be responsible. We know that unpopular welfare state reform, retrenchment, for example, has very complicated and contingent effects in this regard also. So this dissatisfaction rarely finds an outlet in voting behavior, at least not in a simple kind of accountability type way. So this is to say that being dissatisfied with these things is often mixed with a relatively negative experience of democracy. It's mixed with a feeling of not being able to holding power to account. And that is probably why it's plausible to think that more broader political trust orientations are also affected, or even mainly affected, by this type of dissatisfaction. Now, you notice that the talk was called Bringing Performance Back In. It's a little exaggerated maybe, but one of the things we discussed in that book chapter that I showed you was just how performance type explanations have not always been very prominent in this research field. That has varied a little bit over time, but I think it's fair to say that after the financial crisis and onwards, performance type factors have become more sort of at the center of attention again. I think that's true. So I'll show you a few more specific recent publications, papers on this topic. This is all joint work in various constellations with these two colleagues. And I think all these papers, maybe with one exception, can be found at my SSRM page if you're interested in looking at them. But so let's maybe start by looking at the big picture of these things. This is a chapter from a recently published book. And the whole book actually is based on the European Social Survey, and more specifically what we call the welfare module in the European Social Survey, which was there already in 2008. And then I contributed to designing a repeat module in 2016. And this book is sort of based on those data. And so what we do in this particular chapter is just looking at the association between performance evaluations of public services and political trust cross-sectionally, and paying attention to, has it increased in Europe over time? Has that link become stronger over time, let's say after the financial crisis? The thing is that we already know that, that it has become stronger in some places. There is research on Southern Europe in particular, which seems to suggest as much. So we sort of wondered, well, does that apply more broadly to Europe, European countries? And I sort of know that you can't digest this table, but it's just to give you a flavor of what we've done. This is a multi-level model, or multi-level modeling. So here we have, I think it's about 180,000 individuals that have answered the European Social Survey in the years between 2008 and 2016. And it's a three-level model. So you have individuals nested in country years that are nested in countries. There are 21 countries in this particular analysis. And the dependent variable is political trust, an index that taps trust in parliament, politicians, political parties, as I discussed. The key independent variable is then public service evaluation. So we have an overall index with two items that sum up what is actually present in the European Social Survey, which is evaluations of quality in healthcare and in the education system in people's countries. So that's what you have in European Social Survey. And it's not the best index necessarily, but it shows a relatively strong association with political trust, as you can see. Perhaps I'm not going to go into details, but just to say that if you plug a measure like this into a cross-sectional regression analysis of this type, and reasonably well-controlled regression analysis, perhaps, you usually find that these types of performance evaluations are among the more important independent variables, on par with other relatively important factors such as education or evaluations of the macroeconomic situation in your country, for example. So that's what we see. The other thing to note, maybe, unless it's behind some windows, is a set of interactions with year dummies. So, and they basically show that this association was there before, but it became slightly stronger in 2014 and 2016. It's not a gigantic increase by any means. This is a sort of graph showing it. Actually, the y-axis should have been longer to illustrate the point, which is that there's been a very small increase that is statistically significant in a big data set like this, but it's sort of substantively, something like 10% or something like that, 10% increase. So slight increase in this association that already existed before in 2014 and 2016. And then quite obviously things get much more complicated and variable when you look at trajectories within countries. And we can scratch our heads all day long about what's going on here, to the extent that you can see it. But this is sort of what's going on within countries and over time. The thing to note, though, I think, is just the very fact that these effects exist pretty much everywhere and at most time points. It's very rare that these lines sort of dip down to zero. Which is interesting, I think. At least a few years back, when I presented my research in various places, I would often hear that this is typical Scandinavian research. This might be important where you come from, but it's not, it's not so important in, let's say, the UK or Germany or wherever I was presenting. So, and I think it is certainly true that these effects are slightly stronger in Scandinavia. So I think you can see my arrow, my cursor here. So this would be Norway in red and blue. This is Sweden. You might be able to detect that those lines are slightly higher there. But the point is sort of that these are very gradual differences, and these things usually matter in most places. So in addition to finding that these things also became more universally important or more important in most places, in many places since 2016. All right. So that's sort of the big picture, I think. Let's move on to another article that has been out for a while. So this is based on Norwegian data. So in a project that I directed a few years back, we collected panel data in Norway in cooperation with what's called the Gallup Internet Panel. It's changed names since then, but this is what it was called back then. So it's a and these are two-wave panel data collected in 2014 and 15, as you see. And these are data that have some advantages over the European Social Survey, in particular because there are many more measures. We included many more measures of evaluations of public services in these data. So it's rather than having 2, we have more like 20 or something like that, 20 plus various types of services and types of social protection that people get to evaluate. Everything from elder care, child care, employment services, and many, many others. And this matters to the effects. We find you find that this stuff is more important when you have more information about it, perhaps unsurprisingly, but that is what we conclude. So you could say that this European Social Survey Index that many researchers by now have used is something that sort of underestimates these effects vis-a-vis stuff like education or macroeconomic performance or whatever it might be. Another advantage is that these are panel data. So the same individuals are interviewed several times, in this case twice. So that's an advantage. In all fairness, I should say that this data set also has some disadvantages. For example, these data are, the samples are less high quality, less representative, if you like, than something like the European Social Survey or your regular election study or something like that. So it has drawbacks for sure, but I think it's useful to exploit the longitudinal aspect of data like this. And one thing that we did in this paper was fixed effects models. So we could sort of look at the dynamics of these things. And we found that people who become more dissatisfied between 2 panel waves also become less politically trusting. So, which I think strengthens the idea that there is some sort of causal relationship between these variables. We also estimate what you see in the picture here, which is called cross-legged panel models. It's a type of structural equation models that, where we can study, well, what about people who were dissatisfied already in 2014? Do they become, do they become less trusting over time than they already were, and we find that to be the case for several of the measures and aspects we're looking at anyway. Then again, the reverse also seems to be true, possibly, so that people who were already politically distrusting in 2014 tend to become more dissatisfied with performance than they already were, controlling for their initial levels of performance. Interestingly, distrusting people also tend to become more skeptical, more kind of worried about their own socioeconomic risks. So that seems to be the case that political distrust functions as a skepticism generator in this regard. So that might be a reciprocal relationship here between the two. Political trust is both maybe a consequence and a cause of welfare state evaluations. There you go. Just to give you a flavor of what the measures were, I said we included a lot of measures. So we had evaluations of schools and healthcare services. This is what people using the European Social Survey have often been forced to rely on in this research field. We have much more than that. For example, we have a global index of satisfaction in a wide range of public service areas. We ask people about what, the perceived standard of living for a number of key groups that are sort of addressed or protected by various social protection schemes. We also ask about something that I'll go into a little bit more towards the end, which is perceived procedural fairness. What do people think, not about the results or the outcomes or the quality of services and protection, but rather what about the process, the interaction, the experiences all along the way towards outcomes. Various aspects of fairness in that process is also something we ask about. So quite a lot. And this last aspect, the fairness aspect, is sort of the main topic of this article, which is now coming out in Political Studies, co-authored with Lisanne de Block, who's the first author on this paper. So this is exactly about this, sort of output dissatisfaction versus dissatisfaction having to do with procedural fairness. The idea is basically that, people don't just evaluate multiple services and institutions, they evaluate multiple aspects perhaps. And so we dig a little deeper into that. And so we separate between two ideas, you could say. One is the idea that people are mainly output oriented. They don't care about the processes as long as they get what they want, so to speak. They care about results, they care about service quality, they care about benefit generosity, but they don't bother so much with the interaction, the sort of process that leads up to any of that. Second idea being that, well, no, procedures are important. Procedural fairness, the process leading up to results is important. Okay, what does that mean? Well, the concept of procedural fairness or justice is a pretty complex concept. If you look at the research or the literature on this, there are many sort of aspects of it that have been suggested as important. For example, do people feel that they're treated with equal dignity and respect? What about impartiality? The quality of government style explanations. What about corruption even? So there are many sort of candidates, I think. But I think, so what we focus on, I would call the earliest theorized form of fairness. We focus on experienced voice opportunities, which is, can people influence and communicate their views to public employees during the interaction process leading up to welfare state outcomes? Experienced voice opportunities. Do people feel that they're being heard? That they're being heard, that they sort of get a say in the process of service delivery, and how does that affect political trust, if at all? We also look at the interactions between the two. I'll get back to that. Let me just say that I think this is a sort of always a pretty, the sort of fairness perspective is always a pretty attractive idea, especially as mature welfare states kind of experience more and more fiscal difficulties and reform pressures and so on. It's always sort of attractive to think that there's a way of building legitimacy here for the political system that is not about expensive outputs and outcomes. There's a way, maybe cheaper way, to sort of fix the processes and what people actually experience along the way to potentially poor outcomes. That is also important. So I think that is part of the appeal of this idea, potentially. So here's another one of those regression tables that where the idea is not that you should maybe necessarily digest everything, but gives you a feeling for what we've done. These are the same Norwegian panel data that I talked about earlier. Only by the time Lisanne and I started working on this paper, we had a third panel wave. So here we have 3 panel waves. And so we have people who've been pretty much interviewed 3 times. And so we run what's called, well, REWB, random effects within and between models. So basically multi-level models where individual responses over time are nested within the individual, but where you can separate between effects of independent variables and variation between individuals, and the effects of independent variables as they vary over time within individuals. Not sure I expressed that very, very well, but so between effects, so you see them in the yellow circle. These are effects about variation between individuals. It's sort of variation at level 2, if you like, if you think about a multi-level model. And so you basically learn, is it the case that, people who are on average more dissatisfied, are they also on average more politically distrusting? And that's what we find here, the quality of public services seem to matter, the outputs, and that's a big index which captures people's evaluations across about 20 public services and aspects of social policy in Norway. But we also see some effects between individuals of voice, procedural fairness, experienced voice, as I said. And how did we measure that? Well, it's one survey question, and we placed it after people have answered about 25 questions about how satisfied they are with public services. Before that, we have asked about their, if they or family members have experienced these, have had contacts with these things in the last year. And then we asked them to sort of step back, if you like. We asked them, look at your own experiences with public services in the last year. And then there's a question battery where they get to rate different things. And the item we used here is an item that says, employees were helpful and listened to what I have to say. And we find that those who are more satisfied with this aspect are also more politically trusting between individuals now and controlling for lots of stuff, including output satisfaction. All right. So that's the between effects. And then you have within effects in the sort of green circle there, which is which says something about, well, what about the dynamic effects of these things, And here we can see how changes in the independent variables within individuals affect levels of political trust within individuals. So in other words, what's the effect of an individual deviating in a given year from that person's long run average? Does that shift political trust in the expected way over and above, or sort of over and above or below that person's long run average in political trust? And these types of effects are quite often regarded as slightly stronger evidence maybe of causality, although I tend to think that cross-sectional evidence also is also important to evaluate hypotheses. But anyway, and then within the blue circle, you see the interaction effects between these things, and they show something interesting. And I'm going to graph this for you so that you can so that you get to see it. But it basically shows that the impact of output satisfaction becomes weaker at higher levels of procedural fairness, in this case, voice. So, you can say that voice, better voice, more voice, sort of takes the sting out of losing in terms of outputs. Okay, if that makes sense. So, and we find this interaction both cross-sectionally or between individuals, and also when we interact these variables in their dynamic versions. So here's just the graph of that. If you look at the top figure, that sort of tells us the between results between individuals. People who are on average across these three waves more dissatisfied with public service outputs are also less politically trusting. But you also see this interaction, right? That the sort of slope of that dissatisfaction effect becomes sort of weaker and weaker as voice levels go up. So there's an interaction effect there. And then the bottom figure graphs the within results, the longitudinal results, the same variables, but in their dynamic versions. And the results are, similar, if not identical, to the static ones. So, you see that people who in a given year are more satisfied than their long-run satisfaction average across the three waves are also more politically trusting than they usually are. Again, that effect seems to weaken as we look at individuals who in that year seem to experience unusually positive levels of voice. So it's similar, although don't ask me why the top line slopes slightly the wrong direction. I have no explanation for that. So it's but it's similar pattern that certainly compared to the cross-sectional ones, which is satisfying. Yeah. So another way of looking at this interaction is, you can think about it the other way, so to speak. You can say that, well, voice matters, but it doesn't really matter for the satisfied. It begins to matter as outputs, results are evaluated more and more negatively. And this is why the paper, I don't know if you caught the title or not, but the paper is called Losers' Consent in Changing Welfare States. So that's what voice seems to do. It seems to build losers' consent according to our results. So hence the title. I don't know if you think it's surprising or not, but it has been suggested that the interaction runs the other way around. That, look, people are really output oriented. Soft things like fairness, voice, and what have you, it's really just a luxury item. It's stuff that begins to matter once you're really satisfied. Once you've gotten what you want, then you can begin to pay attention to these non-material things, if you like. So there is a strong theory that says it should be the other way around, but that's not what we find. It builds mainly losers' consent according to our results here. And we find similar results both within and between. Yeah. So I'm not sure what time. I think actually I will now wrap up and just some executive summary here. If people were maybe running back and forth, doing domestic chores or whatever. But the key points would be that, yes, welfare state performance evaluations seem to affect political trust, but there are reasons to think that the relationship is probably reciprocal. The effects certainly vary across time and space, but they do exist in most, if not all, European countries at almost all time, the 97 time points where we've studied this. There seems to be an interaction between output satisfaction and experienced fairness going on. Well, I should say first, both seem to have independent effects controlling one for the other, but they also seem to interact such that poor outputs hurt more when voice is poor. Or you could say that voice matters more when outputs are poor. You can think about that interaction in various ways, but those would be the key points anyway, and I'm happy just to go into the Q&A session at this point. I'm not sure what time it is, but there you go.
Okay, thank you so much, Staffan. Thank you very much. It was a very interesting topic, very clear representation.
Thanks.
So, and thank you very much for being punctual. I think it's we have about 30 minutes for a Q&A session. So. So we can start with the questions. If you have, I see Tobias first. If you have questions, please do not hesitate to raise your hand or to use the chat function. So Tobias.
Yes, thank you, Staffan. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. Super interesting for especially also for our project. What I'm wondering is basically what you have been presenting is data based on large scale survey research, sometimes more large scale than others, but clearly large scale. And what you look at is essentially the connection between performance of various welfare services and political trust, but then what you are looking at is actually something like perceived performance of welfare state services. And then I'm wondering, are there also ways of looking at this in looking at more something like more objective ways of looking at more objective performance of welfare services, something like, you know, I mean, you know that in some countries welfare services are not as well developed as in others, and we're really spoiled in the Scandinavian context, I think so. But I already see you seem to have some answer to that.
Yeah, this is sort of one of, I'm not sure my answers are good or not, but it's one of these lucky situations where you actually, so this is one of the slides that didn't make the cut, because obviously you're totally right that if these evaluations matter, well, then what explains the evaluations then? Where do they come from? I've already said that probably to some extent they are colored by political predispositions like political trust, but of course other predispositions, partisanship, ideology, and so on, that probably plays a role. But the key question that you're asking is, you know, well, do they actually depend on something like objective performance? And this is a key question. And this is a forthcoming, another one of these Oxford handbooks, where I've written a chapter on quality of government and welfare state support, where I try to look at a little bit more systematically about what we know. And we need to know much more about this. But I did find that, and now I'm speaking about output evaluations, and in particular in the healthcare area, there seems to be a lot done, or this seems to me to be the area where we know the most. And quite a number of studies actually conclude that objective country differences matter in a basic sense to these evaluations, you know. So people are not totally in the dark of what kind of context they are in, apparently, you know. Although there is, I also am aware of one or two studies that don't find this connection, but it all seems to vary on what variables we're talking about, which also makes sense that not all objective indicators will have an impact on these evaluations. But it's not the case that these things seem totally unrelated to reasonable objective performance indicators, is what I conclude in this chapter. But admittedly, we need much more work on these things. I have done some studies that seem to suggest also that people's personal experiences matter in this regard. There is some experimental evidence, and I'm going to show you just quickly one example of that. So there are some a little bit of experimental evidence on this that I'm aware of and discussed in this chapter. I should say that there's probably more research is needed, but in particular when it comes to procedural fairness and voice, it seems to me to be an area where we need to know more. That, you know, what about these voice evaluations, for example? Are they meaningfully related to the objective extent to which you actually do get a say? You know, that seems to be an area where we need to know more. But just to give you an impression of experimental evidence, so this is what something that I did in this book. So I showed, so I tried to teach people. Took the main conclusions from the executive summaries of the major, what was then in Sweden, the major public researcher-led commission that tried to investigate what happened to the Swedish welfare state in the 1990s. This was in the early 2000s. I think 2006 we did this. So there were several experiments. I know you can't read and digest this, but just to give you a sort of sense of what, and this is, what do the major experts in Sweden emphasize as the main features of current performance of various areas? So try to expose people randomly to information about that, and there would be a control group who were asked other questions, who were asked to engage in this with this substance without teaching them something. Okay, we asked them questions on the same topic, but we didn't give them any information. But we tried to make sure that they spent roughly the same amount of time on thinking about these things, but with no sort of lecturing. And what did we find? Well, low knowledge of these facts in control groups, despite the fact that that sample was skewed towards politically attentive respondents. We did find that people can learn from these types of facts. So when they are exposed to this information, they learn. And well, you can discuss if the effects are strong or not, but they certainly remained some time after. And a few of these fact sheets had also impact on performance evaluations of output performance evaluations of the type that I showed you. Yeah, this is just to give you a flavor of sort of what we know at the moment about this. So I guess the cautious conclusion would be that there seem to be related to underlying information and underlying objective performance indicators, but there's a question of sort of how important it is relative to other factors. All right, so that's just one way of answering it. Great question.
Thank you, thank you very much for the very clear answer. Who else wants to ask a question? I don't see any hands that are raised. So if I may, I take the liberty to answer to ask a question. It's a very basic question. First of all, well, two points. First of all, you presented some results across different countries, right? I don't remember how many countries. They were European countries. Well, if you can say something about the variation, and how would you explain the variation between these countries? And this is in particular interesting for us because we are in a similar stage, and it would be very useful for us to formulate a hypothesis regarding variations of level of trust relationships among between countries. This is my first question, and then if you can, and then just a second point, if you can tell us, give us more information regarding the number of respondents, participants. Yeah, it was just a curiosity. Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So maybe I should share. No, let's see. Okay. One sec. Okay. Just one sec.
It's okay. It's okay. No problem.
Here we are. Okay, so maybe I should just scroll back to this. So
yeah,
this is,
right.
This is our countries, 21 of them. You might be able to make out the abbreviations, but as you can see, there is variation. I mean, my point was just to say that this is of some importance pretty much everywhere. Mm-hmm. But you are totally right that there's variation here across countries, and there's some variation across time. The variation across time, I mean, we found this, so that it's become slightly more important generally in Europe. I think that's the hypothesis there, is just that it's a kind of an effect of the financial crisis and austerity policies, and that these things eventually, after a economic financial crisis, you know, so what I think happens very sort of immediately in an economic crisis, certainly, maybe in a pandemic also, like the one we are now, public services and social protection issues sort of drop out from the public agenda for a little while as we all focus on the crisis. you know, the crisis management, whether it's macroeconomics or sort of pandemic behavior or whatever it might be. But then over time, when we see the light at the end of the tunnel, we begin to, you know, the agenda, the public agenda shifts a little bit, and we begin to talk about the consequences, which groups have suffered here, were our services and institutions ready for this or not, and you get some sort of discussion about who have suffered from this and what could we perhaps do about it or something like that. So it becomes, these issues come back a little bit, and that would be the theory for why we might find an increase here. I've seen this in several economic crises. This is also what you saw in, for example, in Sweden in the early 90s, that welfare state issues actually dropped from the public agenda in the first, maybe the second election after the major financial crisis in the early 90s. But then came back with a vengeance a few years later. So I think I've seen this before. And so I think that's certainly the explanation we evoke in this chapter. But what you asked about was more like all of this, really, I think. And I don't think that anyone has made a particularly sort of good job when it comes to explaining these things. I can only point to general factors that, you know, that generally govern the extent to which evaluations and attitudes have a political impact. For example, general salience. You know, to what extent is this stuff being debated at the moment in a particular polity? And there is some variation across time in all democratic systems. Then I think there are also deeper cross-country differences in the extent to which these issues are sort of culturally ingrained in political debate. I certainly think that in Scandinavia, it's just a knee-jerk reflex to talk about these things, you know, probably because the underlying institutions and policies are so prevalent and expensive, and a slightly larger part of the public budget and so on. So it just becomes a standard topic for debate, you know. And of course, around that, a certain culture develops. You have experts, you have journalists who learn more about the issues. It becomes easier for them for everyone to talk about these things once again, right? So I think there are also deeper cultural event, perhaps also institutional explanations for this. But these are sort of just hypotheses. You know, I mean, it makes you wonder when you see Norway and Sweden here, you know, they're slightly above the level of all other countries. You know, you can think of some cultural and institutional reasons for that, but I'm not aware of anyone who's made sense of this in a broader statistical analysis. Certainly I haven't. So this is just speculation from what you could perhaps expect. Yeah.
Yeah, I think if I may react to your point, I think it's very you're right. It depends on many aspects, but one thing that it could change is that the way and the same issue is differently framed in each country. And I'm particularly sensitive to this topic. It was part of my PhD topic. So I think it's very interesting to know why and how it variates among countries.
Can I ask you what you found out? What you found?
Oh, well, it was yeah, it was very focused on the role of regulators, they act as policymakers. So in some countries, some regulators they can act, policymakers as policy entrepreneurs. So some regulators they in some countries they can act as policy entrepreneurs, and they are able to influence the decision agenda and to raise up some issue and at the decision of the agenda, whether in some other countries they cannot. So I mean, it's very focused on regulators and their role in the agenda setting process, so to say. but yeah, what I observe is that the same issue is framed very differently among different countries, and some frames are more likely to join the decision agenda than other frames. And also some issues can be differently framed over the process during the process, because some issues can more easily join the decision agenda than others. So I think this is also part of this explanation. Yeah. So and then I just wanted to remind you my previous comment, my previous question regarding the number of respondents. I can easily check the papers, but I think it will be useful, especially because we are also running a survey, cross-country, cross-sectoral survey.
Yeah. So here we have.
Yeah. So
something like 9,000 different observations, but these are not individuals. These are repeated.
Sure.
Individuals repeatedly, and then I think the number of individual clusters. I don't know what says clusters. It's just it should be. So it's a 6,500 individuals, something like that.
Okay.
And over here, this is really my personal record. I think. Let me see then. 180,000 individuals in 97 countries. I mean, the European Social Survey is a fantastic data source for these things, and that's why I also said that. Yeah. I'll just stop there. So that answers the question, I suppose.
Okay, thank you. It was just a curiosity, just a curiosity. So thank you very much. I think that no, there is someone that is say goodbye, or maybe.
Can I just ask one thing? And that is, I mean, and I don't want to take you too much out of your comfort zone. So if I do that, then you can say stop. But
okay.
But I mean, this is research about welfare services essentially, but that is, of course, only one thing that governments do. And what several of us are interested in is what comes under the heading of, on the label of regulation. And that is very often stuff that that governments and state agencies and so on, that are doing things that you may not think are so nice. And very often also it is activities that are not necessarily directed at citizens, but more at businesses. So you can think about the performance of governments, let's say about the performance of food safety regulators. Their job is to make sure that you don't get food poisoned when you go to the kebab restaurant, right? So you don't necessarily observe what, as a citizen, what that food safety authority is doing. So I was wondering, are there also debates in the research community about other state activities rather than welfare state helping those who are in need, basically, and education and these sorts of things?
Yeah, I would have to say no, but sort of this is just clearly out of my comfort zone, but I would sort of say that for evaluations of this kind to have a sort of a direct or effect, they need to be perceived as important by citizens, and there needs to be consciousness, and they probably need to be helped by quite a lot of salience debate in the public sphere at any given point in time. So most aspects of these things that you're talking about are probably a little bit off the radar. But there are a few other mechanisms that are known in public opinion, political behavior research, that would suggest that they might sort of have an indirect roundabout effect anyway, that pretty much anything can have an effect if, so for example, a number of years ago, American political psychologist Milton Lodge suggested an online, he called it an impression-driven model of performance evaluation or something like that. He suggested that people have a running tally of when they evaluate government performance, and they encounter all sorts of information during a 4-year election period, right? And they incorporate incoming information into that tally, and then they immediately forget the information that caused the update. But let's say the evaluative or the effective imprint that information might have caused lingers on, right? So that's a mechanism. Another mechanism is, and there's some debate about whether people think like this or not, or whether stuff has to be salient here and now, cognitively salient. Another mechanism is, of course, that one aspect of performance that is really important, generally speaking, and it's the most researched one anyway, is just people's evaluations of the macroeconomy, okay? Unemployment, inflation, GDP growth. And of course, all the regulation surely has an impact on, I mean, this is out of my comfort zone totally, but I would imagine that a lot of the things you have in mind affect that. So, and we know that people definitely evaluate those aspects. So that there are ways for these as factors to sneak into citizens' thinking, even though they don't know about it almost, or that it's not, certainly not sort of packaged and debated by political parties and salient at a given point in time. So that would be my answer, but I know too little about it for sure.
No, but that, I think it's really helpful because it sort of gives, I mean, in the research we are doing in that project, we're having different legs, so to speak, of our project, and one is an expert survey, and the other one is actually experiments with citizens, but they're getting vignettes, and so we're making really salient, some pertinent issues. So they're being told, okay, this is the problem, and then there we do some experiments.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's also very important to take that into account and to sort of make the stuff salient before you treat them, so to speak. Right. In these cases, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
Interesting.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. We are running out of time. If there are any other questions, I think.
Edoardo, this is Esther.
Hi, Esther.
I had another question, so I'm Esther.
Yeah, go ahead, no problem.
It will be a short question, again, also out of curiosity. So I'm from the University of Antwerp, and I have a background in law, and I'm also involved in the TiGRE project. But so what I was wondering in your work, to what extent have you also looked at the shift towards privatization and how, especially in the country comparison, how that works out? So especially also in terms of healthcare services and education, there's of course an important component to that. So I would be curious whether you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah. I can't really claim that it has played a big role, unfortunately. The European Social Survey questions actually ask about the healthcare system and the educational system. So people evaluate whatever mix of public and private they have, and of course, the assumption in my analysis is that whatever that mix looks like, there is a basic political responsibility for that sector, and it makes sense to think that people might generalize in the way that I suggested. But that's the only thing I can say to that, actually. And of course, a lot of the data the other data that I presented is from Norway, where most of the services are, well, public in one way, or clearly public in one way or the other, but it also varies across services. So we are simplifying a little bit, and we're not really exploring these nuances a lot. And I'm sure there's plenty to do there. So for example, I mean, it's interesting to think I'm just speculating now, but to compare totally private services with services who are exposed to some sort of mixed system. Do people know the difference? Are these effects different across these types of services? For example, it's just an obviously interesting type of questions but I haven't looked at it. Which university were you from? Because you went out exactly when you mentioned which university you were from.
Sorry about that. University of Antwerp,
okay.
In Belgium.
Thanks.
Which is a partner of the TiGRE project, as Esther just mentioned. So I think we can end up here. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. Thank you very much for all the comments, and we see you, I think, next week. We have Dominika Latusek presentation. It will be next Wednesday on the 10th of March. I will also have the privilege of chairing Dominika's presentation. So thank you again, Staffan. Of course, you are very welcome to attend all of our upcoming webinars. And thank you very much for the presentation and for joining us.
Thanks so much, everyone, for coming. It was a pleasure. Thanks.
And see you all next week. Bye bye.
Thank you all. Bye bye.